First of all, thank you to everyone who is in the audience today for coming, for participating, for being part of what we've done the past day and a half. I particularly wanted to recognize the folks at the Center for the Humanities who have provided both financial and amazing logistical support. I'm going to just briefly do the names and institutional affiliations of the panel members one more time before we get started with questions among the panelists and also, importantly, from the folks in the audience. And if you guys want to wave when I say your name, Sunil already knows what's up. Sunil Agani, History Department and English Department at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Christopher Hodson, History Department at Brigham Young University. William Nelson, History Department at the University of Miami. Christopher Iannini, English Department at Rutgers. Jose Juve Martin, Hispanic Studies at McGill. Jim Sweet in the History Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Anna Brickhouse in the English Department at the University of Virginia. Bianca Primo in the History Department at Florida International University. and Lisa Voigt in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at The Ohio State University. I hope I did not miss anyone. Excellent. Okay. So I just wanted to start this portion out by asking all of the panelists to think about a really broad and general question that was really the question that kind of generated this symposium for the four of us who organized it. One of the things that we were trying to think about as we organized this was what do we think the future of the Atlantic Studies paradigm is going to be, and what is the place or displace of narrative in that future? So where are we going from here, and what is the place of narrative as we move forward? If you guys want to think about that.
I can say one thing that I'm very appreciative about this conference, and I don't know if it's the future, I hope it is, but it's thinking of incorporating scholars of other non-Anglo areas of the Atlantic in the dialogue, because as we know, it's a paradigm that really has Anglo origins, and as a lot of papers have shown, need not. And in fact, that seems to be the virtue of the paradigm, because as people have noted, can be somewhat limiting because we start thinking about Pacific circulations as well. But the virtue of the paradigm seems to be at least opening things up to see more circulations. And so if this is a sign of where the field of Atlantic studies is moving, I think that's great. I really appreciate being involved here.
Can I add to that too? In some ways, I want to build on what Lisa's saying in response to Ashley's earlier question about intercolonial connections and that kind of thing. And I do want to mention too that it's also really interesting to think about the Atlantic, you know, as several historians have pointed out in their elucidations of what it means to do Atlantic history or Atlantic studies, is that circulations is only one of the possibilities that the Atlantic brings. And it was really intriguing to me in your discussion with Anna about how it's almost, at this stage, it's not satisfying for Anglo-American scholars to trace the connections between metropole and colony or the Americas and Britain. That's a kind of one-way or two-way relationship that doesn't account for the circulations. But it occurred to me that from my perspective, the connections have been drawn already between the Spanish-American colonies or Brazil up through the other colonies, French colonies and British colonies, even Dutch colonies. Those comparisons are plentiful, or those connections have been traced in a plentiful way, and we are lacking that kind of two-directional comparison between metropole and colony. So there's all kinds of open lacuna. No one way of conceiving of either tracing circulation or comparison has been exhausted. I think anytime that we feel like the Atlantic has exhausted its possibilities, we should look more closely at each individual area.
I can add to that with the sense that, I mean, it's one elaboration of this same issue, and that is that the whole notion of colonialism and empire, I think, the idea that it's a peculiarly European phenomenon is just wrong-headed. I didn't say this in my presentation earlier today, but this expansion I was talking about was an imperial expansion. There's African empire that's happening, and it's very firmly integrated into this larger world. So I think one of these questions without ever asking the question. Oftentimes people just assume that empire is reduced to a European sort of aspect, and I think it misses. And they're indigenous empires as well that are integrated into the, earlier, obviously, but still have resonances in the very worlds that we're writing and thinking about. So,
can I say something? Yeah, I think that's an important point to make. But the reason that the study of European empire remains significant is we can think of the Ottoman Empire, we can think of other powerful empires, not to mention those of China that have existed, but part of what lends currency to the study of European empire is the way that it may or may not have something to do with the later formation of the networks that seem to define the modern world. So I don't know, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about that. I mean, the expansion of Dahomey, how do you think that fits into some relationship to the shape of the modern world? Because to me, that's what's significant about the study of European empire, because it's ironic that the intercolonial aspects of the conference and the way in which we are going between French, Spanish, and Portuguese empire is actually a return to an 18th century paradigm. I mean, Reynal's History of the Two Indies, by being a history of a bunch of trading companies, including the Dutch actually, already had that trans-Indic notion. It was moving between a very comparative colonial space that the monolingual approach did not. So, I don't know, those are two separate questions, but I thought that we could perhaps address those together. I'm curious to hear what others think.
My immediate response to that is that the expansion of Dahomey is very firmly integrated into this modern world. I mean, Agajot's expulsion of someone like Domingos Alvarez and others like him was not very much different than the Catholic Church expulsion of him to Lisbon, and then the ultimate expulsion of him to Castro-Marinas. This is all tied up in the very same world. And so I would say that the sort of, what's interesting about this notion of modernity is that becomes the end point at which we're focused, I think, oftentimes, with the assumption that it was preordained. And I think that in the moment that these contestations, particularly in places like Brazil, where I don't think, and another thing we oftentimes forget, of course, is that these circulations brought, in terms of numbers of people, far more Africans to the Americas than they did Europeans, particularly up to 1800. So I just think that we really need to deeply historicize some of these questions in their moments, rather than thinking about sort of the ends that they achieve in terms of modernities, in terms of empire, and the things that I think it's the history of the victors before you're putting the cart before the horse without recognizing. I think that there are these other groups that are informing the very modernity that I think we celebrate now. I mean, that's sort of what I was trying to get out in my paper earlier today as well.
But even if we were to take that example, right, David Scott, since several people mentioned him, makes the point that if Toussaint is the first modern intellectual, it's as a conscript of modernity. So the circumstances which brought so many Africans to the New World are very different than the circumstances that brought Europeans to the New World, both Brazil and North America. So if we take that idea of a conscript, it's a different relationship to the modern world that we also need to put into that narrative, and not just push it aside as itself mistaken.
No, I'm not saying it should be pushed aside, or it's quite the contrary. I'm just saying I think that this notion of an intellectual, I think intellectualism is also very much tied up in this notion of what we think of as modernity. And I think that part of this is thinking about other epistemologies, other categories of intellectuals. And I think the contestations that are going on in the Atlantic world are very much about who is asserting power through intellect. And these are struggles over knowledge, ultimately, I think. And I firmly believe that those struggles were not preordained or predefined by sort of a European teleos. And I'm defending the African turf on the one hand, but I think there's an indigenous answer to these questions as well.
As well as maybe a...
I like to work on narrative. And one of the things that I found very interesting was listening to each of your presentations, thinking about such questions as, is narrative necessary? What kinds of conclusions or knowledges are being implied or forced on material by the forms of the narratives, either that you're considering or that you're yourselves using? In what directions can you see narratives of the Atlantic going?
I think one thing to note is just how incredibly effective narratives was at bringing certain narrative devices to the fore in each of the panels. It was almost uncanny that way. The example that I'm thinking of most immediately is that first panel where this notion of a kind of counterfactual text that almost was as a narrative device for making a certain kind of experience or historical perception visible, that was really obvious. And I thought of it, selfishly, as these things often go, because I almost wrote a paper that was about a text that almost was. I was going to write about a version of Notes on the State of Virginia, imagining a version of Notes on the State of Virginia that incorporates Jefferson's correspondence on Haiti and kind of rewrites his imagination of slave revolution through that. So, I mean, the way I think of it, 3 examples probably means it's worth generalizing wildly about whether there's some kind of necessary or revealing relationship between that device of a kind of counterfactual text and getting at some kind of Atlantic experience.
I mean, the first thing is that